Next up on our land use section is Indigenous Peoples Land Management. We'll see what the definition of Indigenous Peoples is according to UN organizations that do these things. This is ranked at number 39 with 6.19 gigatons in reduced CO2 by 2050, but also the number of CO2 protected is 849.37 in gigatons. Global cost and saving data is again too variable to be determined. The problem of indigenous people is probably well known to most of the people on the planet in terms of their constant threat from the threat they face from mining, logging, oil exploration and so on, and they actually don't own as much as land as they end up managing in direct and indirect ways. And there are even groups like what are called Adivasis, original residents in countries like India, which are not even listed as indigenous people, but you see they carry their own culture, their ways of lives, their traditions and their relations with the surroundings around them and so on and so forth. So this I took from Amnesty, but originally comes from UN document. Indigenous peoples can be identified according to certain characteristics. Most importantly, they self-identify as indigenous peoples. There is a historical link with those who inhabited a country or region at the time when people of different cultures or ethnic origins arrived. This is true for most of the newer colonies like the US, Australia, and so on. They have a strong link to territories and surrounding natural resources, which is always true. They have distinct social, economic, or political systems. That's always very distinct as well. They have a distinct language, culture, and beliefs. They are marginalized and discriminated against by the state, especially when they don't have the full participation in the system in terms of voting and economic power and access to information and so on. They tend to be marginalized. They maintain and develop their ancestral environments and systems as distinct peoples. Okay, so I just show a couple of maps. This is from National Geographic, which nicely lists all the known indigenous people. So you know, the US has had a large number of indigenous people who are relegated somewhat to various reservations after colonization happened a couple of centuries ago. And Spaniards colonized much of South America, and they have also created all sorts of conflicts, coexistences, land tenure issues, lifestyle alterations and so on. Even Greenland has some, all the way into the Arctic Circle with Inupiat, Yupik and other Inuits. Africa, of course, the old populations of indigenous people. South Asia, China, Mongolia, all the way into up here in Russia and Australia, Southeast Asia, and so on. There are some maps which are a little bit more detailed. So this is American Indians and Alaska Natives. As you know, the word Indians was attached to these Native Americans because of Columbus making a mistake about where he had landed. And there are some details here that I'm not getting into, but here is another map of South Central America, which is showing indigenous peoples in Latin America. And overall, the population estimates range from about 370 million to upwards of 500 million. This image and the one on the succeeding page were taken on behalf of the International Conservation Fund of Canada, which has worked with the Kayapo people to protect their 26 million acre land holdings from encroaching loggers. So when a little indigenous community is managing and living within the confines of such a large area, and it is full of resources, then obviously there are people encroaching or trying to encroach in terms of loggers, miners, Brazilian frontier society, and so on. From satellite photographs, the Kaipo traditional lands in Mato Grosso and Pará are a jewel of the Amazon, emerald and unblemished. On the margins of their land are the roads, clearings, frontier towns, and billowing smoke from fires clearing the land for cattle and farming. We saw that in the protection of forest, that the most favorite way of clearing forests for grazing tends to be set fire, which is rather destructive and unproductive way. The efforts of the Kaipo have not always succeeded. Construction on the hugely destructive Belo Monte Dam on the Xingu River of Pará commenced in March 2011 after decades of legal and political resistance. It continues to be contested on legal fronts. Some politicians that get elected openly claim that these things don't need protection. So indigenous people everywhere always face issues with not just human rights, but also land ownership, tenure, and so on and so forth. Traditional systems indigenous people use have the potential for increasing above and below ground carbon stocks, which is why we are talking about it in drawdown, and reducing greenhouse gas emissions via a range of practices they have carried forward for many millennia. Local indigenous communities practice many different ways of living within the ecosystem boundaries through swidden or shifting agriculture, which also tends to be referred to as slash and burn, where you do agriculture, you burn the residues, you leave the land fallow for recovery, and then you come back after doing agriculture elsewhere. Agroforestry, or what we called tree intercropping. Pastoralism, where people are nomadic tribes settling in different parts of a large rangeland, which often is considered unproductive, not very cultural or whatever, and they are forced to assimilate into the system, or their land that they use for living nomadic life and regenerating different parts and using different parts are taken over by the governments or private ownerships and so on and so forth. They do fishing, hunting, gathering, and traditional forest management. Many of these cultures have coexisted with nature's cycles and resources over a long durations of time without depleting them in places inhabited over millennia in some cases. So the idea is that generally they are more in harmony with the nature they live in, because their livelihood depends on maintaining and nurturing the nature and the resources they exploit in terms of food, fodder, medicine, water, etc. And the traditional systems include home gardens, which are separate from the agriculture, so they grow things like vegetables, flowers, medicines, whatever, spices, maybe chilies, etc. And these are not as tilled as agricultural lands, and they tend to be good at sequestering more carbon. Agroforestry, which always we have already mentioned several times, has the advantage of reducing soil loss, increasing soil organic carbon, water retention capacity, soil moisture persistence, drought resilience, non-rainy season income, and so on and so forth, evaporation loss, etc. Sweden, which we just mentioned, the shifting agriculture, pastoralism, as we said, nomadic cultures living on livestock and moving around, managing the large rangelands. Fire management, which is much better in terms of removing fuel and preparing it for the next season and so on. And community managed forests. So even when they don't own the forest, they manage the forest as communities, and they don't always have ownership. Okay, so indigenous peoples have secure land tenure on 1.3 billion acres globally, though they live on and manage much more. estimated to be almost 10 times, well, at least 5 times that. Our analysis assumes higher rates of carbon sequestration and lower rates of deforestation on lands managed by indigenous people. Data over many millennia would suggest that. If forest land under secure tenure grows by 909 million acres by 2050, reduced deforestation could result in 6.1 gigatons of carbon dioxide emission avoided by these reduced deforestation, etc. This solution could bring the total forest area under indigenous management to 2.2 billion acres from 1.3 billion acres officially under them, securing an estimated protected stock of 232 gigatons of carbon, roughly equivalent to over 850 gigatons of carbon dioxide if released into the atmosphere. Again, using that stoichiometry 3.7 conversion from carbon to carbon dioxide. Okay, so this is a issue of populations that are vulnerable, that are subject to lots of pressures from modern societies, and they face constant threat of their livelihood and their ownership of land and access to their own resources and so on.